Please won't you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts together find their way into the heart of God this morning. Amen. So, beloved, here's our starting place. You are loved by a love you can't even imagine. You are loved by a love you can't even imagine. Father Greg Boyle says, human beings are settlers, but not in the pioneer sense. It is our human occupational hazard to settle for little. We settle for purity and piety when we are being invited into an exquisite holiness. We settle for the fear-driven when love longs to be our engine. We settle for a puny, vindictive God when we are being nudged always closer to this wildly inclusive, larger than any life God. We allow our sense of God to atrophy. We settle for the illusion of separation when we are endlessly asked to enter into kinship with all. You, beloved, are loved with a love beyond all imagination. Father Boyle is a Jesuit priest who started Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, which has grown into the largest gang rehab intervention and reentry program in the world. Each year, they help more than 10,000 people change their lives in concrete ways, including through substance abuse assistance, mental health support, and tattoo removal. Father Boyle started this ministry in his parish in East LA because he was simply responding to what he describes as a lethal absence of hope. Nobody has met a hopeful kid that joins a gang, he says. His way of responding to hopelessness is creating loving communities of kinship among former gang members, precisely to counteract mounting lovelessness, racism, and the cultural disparagement that keeps us apart, he says. And sometimes it feels like the entire United States is embroiled in ceaseless gang warfare over mounting lovelessness, racism, division, mass shootings, deaths of despair, cultural disparagement. We are collectively experiencing a lethal absence of hope. We come to church because here we can catch a glimpse of a different world, one that resembles earth as it is in heaven. How many of you have seen glimpses of heaven in the airport? Oh, nobody's raising their hand? The poet Naomi Shihab Nye does in her poem, right? Even amid the cranky passengers and canceled flights. In her story, people looked up from their phones long enough to try to understand each other's language, to quell fear, to quell each other's fears, to laugh together, to stay rooted, to share in communion with powdered date cookies and apple juice from the airline. This is the world I want to live in too, the shared world. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. God says through the prophet Isaiah that the shared world is possible, a world in which the ancient ruins will be rebuilt and every need will be satisfied. Hunger and thirst will be quenched, where we, yes, you and me, can become light in a very dark place. All we have to do, the prophet says, is to stop pointing the finger at each other, to stop speaking evil, instead to offer food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted. understand another's language, the hopes and fears and needs of our neighbors, to take the cookies when offered, to approach strangers as if they are a piece of us that we do not yet know. God says if we can do that, we will become repairers of the breach. The word breach has an interesting usage in the English language when it comes to our relationship with each other and with God. It is similar to the definition that we use for sin, separation between one another, and therefore separation from God. So here's a list of synonyms, really? Synonyms. I get paid to be a public speaker. Here is a list of synonyms for breach taken from the dictionary. Break, gap, opening, rupture, split, alienation, schism. One dictionary definition of breach is a breaking of relations, an estrangement, a quarrel, a broken state. The breach is the chasm between the world as it is and the world as God dreams it to be. And as long as we are estranged from our brothers and sisters, our neighbors, our enemies, we stand in the breach in need of repair. The breach is not unique to this time or this place or this culture. This chapter in Isaiah addresses the community returning from the Babylonian exile to the Persian-ruled territory of Judah in the years following 539 BCE. This may seem like a foreign ancient world to us, but their problems aren't unfamiliar at all. The Persian emperors saw themselves as liberators and restorers after a time of conquest and exile by the Babylonian and Assyrian rulers. But Judah is run by a dysfunctional government. There were extreme social, economic, and religious divisions in the capital of Jerusalem. The people who had returned after exile were charged with rebuilding a divided and destroyed society from the rubble. But the empire was working against them by creating division. In Judah, there was vast economic disparity, and the wealthy elite created a fear of foreigners and skepticism of cultural change among the poor in order to keep them fighting against each other. They fought over ethnic and linguistic purity and right religious practice. But the leaders of the religious and political elite were particularly corrupt. They used the Sabbath day to pursue their own interests. They stole money from the funds that the Emperor Cyrus gave them to rebuild Jerusalem's temple in order to live lavish lifestyles high on the hog. They blamed the recent immigrants and ethnic minorities and the poor farmers for the delay in rebuilding the temple to distract from their own greed, abuse of power, and self-interest. The prophet in our text from Isaiah rebukes those who insist on religious, ethnocentric, and racist nationalism in order to wield power and make mass amounts of money off a gullible and weak populace. The prophet instead offers a different vision, the shared world. In the shared world, he points us toward there is justice. In the shared world, there is food for all. In the shared world, there is water for the thirsty. In the shared world, there is rest. In the shared world, there is delight even. And the prophet tells us that we are to be repairers of the breach. So how do we do that? How do we do that when it seems the chasm between us is so large? It's simple, the prophet says. Feed the hungry. Remove the yoke of oppression. Stop answering to the emperor rulers on Fox News and your overlords, Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, and start sharing the resources you have with your neighbors who need it. We don't need to wait on God or the government to do it for us. We can do it ourselves. We are to be called repairers of the breach. Only then will we be healed. The prophet says, only then will we be blessed. Then we will be light in the darkness. Then we will be like water quenching thirst. Then we will construct a community worthy of God's favor, one in which all of humanity is seen as children of the same Father, one in which, when we are given the false choice between loving our neighbor and loving our religion, we always choose our neighbor. The shared world. This is what a life of faith calls us to, crossing boundaries, cultivating humility and compassion, and the willingness to be transformed. It starts with knowing we are loved by a love we cannot imagine. We can't restore what's ruined without that as a starting point. Beloved, you are loved by a love you cannot even imagine, and so is every single person you meet. The centerpiece of Father Doyle's ex-gang rehab program, Nicole Golden writes, is an 18-month training program of various phases. Components are GED classes and educational workshops, apprenticeships, therapy including anger management, and free tattoo removal. A paid physician's assistant and volunteer doctors make the removal program possible. So there's health care too. Criteria for participation by serious offenders are a referral, a desire to want change, passing drug tests, and former gang involvement. When Father Greg Boyle makes presentations, he usually takes 2 people from the program with him to tell their stories. One man, Jose, spoke to 600 social workers in Virginia. He told them that when he was 6, his mother suggested he kill himself. They collectively gasped, and Jose's mom abandoned him at an orphanage, claiming she found him. His grandmother rescued him, but he later suffered abuse from his mother. His habit of wearing 3 layers of shirts to hide wounds extended into his adulthood. Father Boyle recounted Jose's words, "Now I welcome my wounds. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds?" Despising the wounded is an idea rooted in this world, said Father Boyle. Mario was petrified at his first speaking engagement. The most heavily tattooed, he was also the most gentle, the priest recalled. When a woman at that program asked what wisdom he imparted to his children, Mario expressed the hope that they would not be like him. She countered with, "You are loving, kind, gentle, and wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you." 1,000 strangers clapped for a long time in that moment, and Mario held his face in his hands. A room of strangers had returned him to himself, and they were returned to themselves, Father Doyle said. Beloved, you are loving, kind, gentle, and wise. Your wounds are welcomed here. Don't settle. Don't settle for kinship with only the people who live and think and act like you. Don't settle for that puny, vindictive God we made in our puny, vindictive image. We can counteract mounting lovelessness together. Our birthright is exquisite holiness. Love longs to be our engine. Our hope lies in our radical unity with each other and with God. So nudge yourself closer to this wildly inclusive, larger than any life God who loves you beyond your imagining. When we do this, we can become repairers of the breach, restorers of the ruined cities. A room full of strangers reflecting the love of God can return us back to ourselves. This is the world that I want to live in, the shared world. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. Amen.